And Barry has some books if you need a book. Anybody need a book? Seth, would you mind leading us in prayer as we get started?
Let's pray. Heavenly Father, thank you for another Lord's Day to come and worship you and study your word. Heavenly Father, pray that you'll be with us this time, be with Chris as he brings us a lesson. Pray that we'll take what we learned, apply it to our day, walks of life. Heavenly Father, please be with him and all the teachers down the stairs. Forgive us our sins. In Jesus' name, amen.
Thank you, Seth. Well, I'm excited this morning because we're continuing our study of Judges, and I get to talk about a judge that people have actually heard of and actually know something about, and I know something about, so that will hopefully make it easier to talk about. You know, we've been looking at these judges, and some of them, you know, we recognize the names, but if somebody asked us a quiz about what they actually did, it might be pretty tough. And last week, Eric gave us a good lesson about Jephthah. And after Jephthah, there were 3 more judges that are mentioned at the end of chapter 12 of Judges that we know very little about. There was Ibzan, and the thing about Ibzan, I think, is he had 30 daughters. That's what stuck out in my mind, and that's 10 times more than I have, and about 27 too many it would be my thinking on that. But he had a bunch of daughters, and then you have Elon and Abdon. Abdon had 40 sons, which is a whole lot too, but those guys judged, and other than their kids, how many kids they have, we really don't know a whole lot about them, but they judged about 25 years after Jephthah that we studied about last week. And then we roll into chapter 13, and chapter 13 begins with, stop me if you've heard this before, the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord. Okay, this is kind of a common theme. The Lord delivered them into the hands of the Philistines for 40 years, just back and forth, and we've talked about that over and over, just that back and forth, that they would do evil, they'd be delivered into the hands of oppressors, they would cry out for mercy, and it would just be back and forth. Well, after they're delivered into the hands of the Philistines, they've been under subjections to the Philistines for a while. An angel appears to a couple who don't have children, and this angel tells them that they're going to have a son, and that son would be Samson. That all of us grew up studying about Samson. And the angel tells them that Samson is to be raised a Nazirite. He's to be a Nazirite. Now, the Nazirite vow is something that you can read about in Numbers chapter 6, and we're not going to take the time to read that, but essentially there were, 3 or 4 components to a Nazirite vow. Number 1, it was generally voluntary. You weren't forced to take a Nazirite vow. A Nazirite vow, by the way, was just a vow of separation to God, that we were going to spend a voluntary and usually a temporary amount of time just being closer to God and doing certain things that would hopefully draw us closer to God. And it was temporary, it was voluntary. What New Testament character, what famous New Testament character do you remember who took a temporary Nazirite vow? Paul did, yeah, Paul. And you can read about that in Acts, I think Acts chapter 18. Paul took a Nazirite vow, and really there were about 3 characteristics besides the fact that it was voluntary and it was temporary. 1, you had to abstain from wine or other strong drink. 2, you were not to come in contact with a dead body. And 3 is what Samson is very famous for. What was that? Not cutting your hair. That was the 3rd component. So Samson was to take this Nazirite vow, and it was unique for Samson in that it wasn't voluntary. In his case, he was told, or his parents were told before he was ever born, that he was going to be a Nazirite. It wasn't temporary. It was to be a lifelong commitment to Samson. And the 3rd unique thing about Samson's Nazirite vow is that each of those three things that I mentioned, the abstaining from strong drink, the not coming in contact with a dead body, and the not cutting the hair, he broke every one of those. He broke every one of those Nazirite commandments, if you will, before his life was over. Samson to me is a complicated character because Samson, on the one hand, was a man of great faith. And we see his great faith, but we also read about it in Hebrews 11. And I want to read along with other judges that we've studied about. And we may have already read this in previous classes, but let's read it again. In verse 32 of Hebrews 11, "And what more shall I say? For the time would fail me to tell of Gideon and Barak and Samson and Jephthah, also of David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith subdued kingdoms, worked righteousness, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the violence of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, out of weakness were made strong, became valiant in battle, turned to fight the armies of the aliens." And of course it continues. So on the one hand, here's Samson, a man of such great faith that he was memorialized in the book of Hebrews chapter 11 that we all recognize as being Faith's Hall of Fame, mentioned alongside people like Abraham and Moses and Abel and other characters who had a lot of faith. But the other side of Samson is that he was I'm going to describe him as a flawed individual who made bad choices. He was a flawed individual who made bad choices. And you can see his bad choices in the first words that he spoke. Let's look at that in verse or chapter 14, Judges 14. We don't know how old Samson was, but I think these are the first words that are recorded. In verse 2, he went up and told his father and mother, saying, "I have seen a woman in Timnah of the daughters of the Philistines. Now therefore get her for me as a wife." Then his father and mother said to him, "Is there no woman among the daughters of your brethren or among all my people that you must go and get a wife from the uncircumcised Philistines?" And Samson said to his father, "Get her for me, for she pleases me well." When you read that sentence, "Get her for me, for she pleases me well," just based on that sentence alone, how would you describe Samson? Selfish? Conceited. That's a good word.
Sounds spoiled.
Spoiled? Yeah, he does. Yeah, all that's all true. And you know, it's easy for us to see that, right? It's easy for us to look at Samson and see that he's selfish, he's conceited, he's got this spoiled, arrogant attitude because it was like he didn't care what his parents thought. He didn't care what God's law said because God's law was pretty specific and pretty plain about not marrying other nations, the uncircumcised Philistines being one of those. And it's easy for us today to look at Samson and look at that sentence and just immediately get on Samson, and rightfully so. But don't we do the same thing? I mean, if we're honest with ourselves, Samson's problem was he saw what he wanted, and he wanted it, and he said, "I'm going to have it, and I don't really care what God's law says." Excuse me. Now, he probably wouldn't have said that out loud in those ways, but his actions, that's what he was saying. "I want to have what I want, and I don't really care what God has to say about it." And if we're honest with ourselves, and I'll be the first to say, sometimes we have that attitude. And really that's what sin is, right? Sin is a transgression of the law, and it's most of the time not that I don't know what God wants, it's that what I want takes precedence in my mind over what God wants. And we don't always stop to think about it that way, but that's essentially when we sin what we're saying. Hey, I want what I want. And so while we're looking at Samson, it's kind of like, you know, what Jesus said in, I think it was Matthew 7. He talked about the speck and the beam. He said, you can see the speck in your brother's eye, but you don't notice the beam that's in your own eye. Well, we can see Samson's guilty in his problems, but I think a lot of times, if we're not careful, we do the exact same things and have this same attitude that Samson had of, I want what I want, and I'm going to have what I want, regardless of whether or not it's the right thing to do. So, that's the paradox to me of Samson, and I think we'll continue to see that over the next couple of weeks. That on the one hand, he's a man of faith, and he proves that in the lessons that we're going to look at. But on the other hand, he's that deeply flawed individual who makes bad choices. But if that tells you, if that verse 3 tells you what you need to know about Samson, and we're able to see that he's selfish and conceited and all those terms, I think the next verse tells us all we need to know about God. Because the next verse, verse 4, says, "But his father and mother did not know that it was of the Lord, that he was seeking an occasion to move against the Philistines, for at that time the Philistines had dominion over Israel." God was able to use this flawed individual who made bad choices to do what he wanted done. Despite the fact that Samson was not perfect by any means, God was able to use him to do what he wanted done. So the question that I would ask is, do we know any flawed individuals who make bad choices? Are there? Yeah, you're going to raise your hand. Don't look to the person next to you, right? I mean, it's us. It's each of us. Each of us are flawed individuals who make bad choices, just like Samson did. And I would imagine, actually I know, if God could use Samson to do what he wanted done, he can use each of us, even though we're flawed and we make bad choices sometimes, to do what he wants done, to expand his kingdom, to spread the message of Christianity to others. Now, I don't read this and think, well, God wanted Samson to make bad choices. God encouraged that, but he knew it was going to happen, and he used Samson anyway. And just in a similar manner, he doesn't want us to make bad choices, but we're going to, and yet the beautiful thing is he can still use us. He doesn't cast us aside because we're imperfect. He knows we're imperfect, but he loves us anyway, he cares for us anyway, and we can be of great value in his kingdom despite the fact that we're flawed and we're imperfect. But anyway, Samson, he wants this Philistine woman. He decides he's going to have this Philistine woman. So he goes down to Timnah to see her, and we won't read all of this, but I'll give you the Cliff Notes version. A lion attacks him. That doesn't happen in Carthage, but apparently it happened on the road to Timnah, that a lion attacks him, and he just tears this lion apart. The text says, the Spirit of the Lord came upon him mightily. So it was God who gave him the strength, obviously, to rip this lion apart, kill this lion, and he goes on about his way. Sometime later, he's coming back down this same road, and he sees the carcass of the lion, and there's a swarm of bees in the carcass. He's hungry, so he reaches in and has some honey out of the carcass of the lion and eats the honey. So in doing so, and having contact with that carcass, what has he done? He came in contact with a dead body, which we said was one of the things he was not supposed to do as a Nazirite. So we're kind of building this profile of Samson, and it's easy to see that if he wants something, he's going to have it. If he wants this woman, he's going to have it. If he wants food, even though he's not supposed to, he's going to have it. If he wants vengeance, which he often did, he's going to have it. And that's just kind of his attitude. And hopefully we can learn from that and maybe avoid some of the same problems that he falls into. But the reason I tell the story of the lion is when he had his wedding feast, that's when, remember, he posed the riddle to the Philistines. And if you remember the story of Samson, you'll remember this riddle that out of the eater came something to eat, and out of the strong came something sweet. And so he posed that to the Philistines, and if they guessed the riddle, he was going to give them 30 changes of clothing. If they couldn't guess it, he would get 30 changes of clothing. So they obviously didn't know the answer to the riddle. They go to this Philistine woman that Samson has married during this feast, says, if you don't tell us the answer, if you don't find out from Samson the answer, we're going to kill you and your father. We're going to burn you and your father. And so she comes to Samson, please tell me the answer to the riddle. He doesn't do it. He won't tell her. Comes to her again. Please tell me the answer to the riddle. She won't do it. During the 7 days, every day, she comes to Samson, please tell me the answer to the riddle. Finally, he's had enough of this pestering and tells her the answer to the riddle. Now, I know that's not realistic in today's day. I know that no woman would ever pester us as men enough that we would give in, or vice versa. So this is probably not realistic, but it happened then. Okay, she wore him down until he finally gave in. Tells the answer to the riddle. She immediately goes and tells her brethren, the Philistines, and they guess the answer. Okay, what is sweeter than honey and what is stronger than a lion? That was the answer to the riddle. Samson knows that they got the answer from this Philistine woman, and so he goes and kills 30 of their men to get their clothes to fulfill the bet, which is, I guess, pretty neat way to fulfill the bet, I guess, is what he was thinking. But his anger was aroused there at the end of chapter 14. He went back to his father's house, and Samson's wife was given to his companion who had been his best man. And all of that introduction leads us to what's actually our lesson this morning. But I felt like we needed that introduction really to understand the lesson. And the lesson is actually chapter 15, but you really needed that preamble, I guess, to understand chapter 15. So let's read the first few verses of chapter 15. After a while, in the time of wheat harvest, it happened that Samson visited his wife with a young goat. And he said, let me go into my wife into her room, but her father would not permit him to go. Her father said, I really thought that you thoroughly hated her, therefore I gave her to your companion. Is not her younger sister better than she? Please take her instead. And Samson said to them, this time I shall be blameless regarding the Philistines if I harm them. And Samson went and caught 300 foxes, and he took torches, turned the foxes tail to tail, and put a torch between each pair of tails. When he had set the torches on fire, he let the foxes go into the standing grain of the Philistines, and burned up both the shocks and the standing grain, as well as the vineyards and the olive groves. Then the Philistines said, who has done this? And they answered, Samson, the son-in-law of the Timnite, because he has taken his wife and given her to his companion. So the Philistines came up and burned her and her father with fire. Samson said to them, since you would do a thing like this, I will surely take revenge on you, and after that I will cease. So he attacked them hip and thigh with a great slaughter. Then he went down and dwelt in the cleft of the rock of Edom. So Samson goes, it seems like, to consummate the marriage with his Philistine wife, and that's when he finds out she's been given to somebody else. The father said, look, I thought you were mad. I thought you were angry, so we gave her to somebody else. Here's her sister, who's even better, and I don't know what that says about the father, that he says, oh, her sister's even better than she is, but that doesn't pacify Samson, so he goes really to extreme methods to burn their crops. It makes me wonder, why all this extravagance? The 300 foxes that he gets, I think it was 300 that he gets, and ties them tail to tail with torches between them and just goes through the standing grain. It would have been a lot easier to just take a Zippo, a cigarette lighter, or a torch or whatever he happened to have, and just set the field on fire. We used to do a lot of that years ago, and I've seen fields burn to clean them off. Now, most people just spray or bush hog or something, but used to, they would set fields on fire, and a lot of you have probably seen that done, to get rid of everything. And you set that field on fire, if weather conditions are right, it'll burn up in a matter of seconds, a huge field. So why didn't Samson do that? Why do you think he went to the extreme of, and the trouble of getting a bunch of foxes and tying them up and doing it that way? This is a question that has no right or wrong answer, so we're just speculating. So
I find it very impressive that he can catch 300 foxes.
It is impressive that he could catch 300 foxes. It could be because he could.
This way or this way. Maybe this saved him from running around and lighting everything with a torch.
I wonder if it had something to do with he wanted it to be obvious that it was Samson that did it. Like if he wanted it to be known, Samson doesn't strike me as someone who was timid or would be afraid that somebody would find out that he did this. I think, and this is just opinion, but I think he wanted them to know. I think he wanted it to be obvious to the Philistines that Samson is the one who did this. And maybe that had nothing to do with it. I don't know. But they did find out. They did realize that it was Samson that did it. And so to get vengeance on him, they burned his wife and her father, which, remember, is what they had threatened to do in the previous chapter involving the riddle. So she avoided getting burned alive once, but she didn't this time. So that ultimately still happened to her. I don't know if they thought that would appease Samson or if they did it for vengeance, but regardless, he was not happy, and he attacks them, it says hip and thigh with a great slaughter, and just whips a bunch more of them, and that's where we stopped with verse 8. Any comments so far before we read the rest of the chapter? Well, let's continue in picking up in verse 9. Now the Philistines went up and camped in Judah and deployed themselves against Lehi. And the men of Judah said, "Why have you come up against us?" Now recognize these are Samson's people. These are Israelites, people of Judah. So these are Samson's, he would think, his allies. All right. So they answered, "We have come up to arrest Samson, to do to him as he has done to us," that being the Philistines. Then 3,000 men of Judah went down to the cleft of the rock of Edom and said to Samson, "Do you not know that the Philistines rule over us? What is this you have done to us?" And he said to them, "As they did to me, so I have done to them." But they said to him, "We have come down to arrest you, that we may deliver you into the hand of the Philistines." Then Samson said to them, "Swear to me that you will not kill me yourselves." So they spoke to him, saying, "No, but we will tie you securely and deliver you into their hand, but we will surely not kill you." And they brought him bound with 2 new ropes and brought him up from the rock. When he came to Lehi, the Philistines came shouting against him. Then the Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon him, and the ropes that were on his arms became like flax that is burned with fire. And his bonds broke loose from his hands. He found a fresh jawbone of a donkey, reached out his hand and took it, and killed 1,000 men with it. Then Samson said, with the jawbone of a donkey, heaps upon heaps, with the jawbone of a donkey, I have slain 1,000 men. And so it was, when he had finished speaking, that he threw the jawbone from his hand and called that place Ramoth Lehi. Then he became very thirsty, so he cried out to the Lord and said, "You have given this great deliverance by the hand of your servant, and now shall I die of thirst and fall into the hands of the uncircumcised?" So God split the hollow place that is in Lehi, and water came out, and he drank, and his spirit returned, and he was revived. Therefore he called its name En-Hakkore, which is in Lehi to this day, and he judged Israel 20 years in the days of the Philistines. So it's interesting. Samson is in contact with these 3,000 Israelites. And these 3,000 Israelites are so scared of the Philistines that they're willing to turn Samson over. And what's interesting, and Brother Webster in the commentary in the book talks about this, these are people who didn't hesitate to turn their backs on God. They were not at all faithful to God for any length of time, but they're pretty faithful to the Philistines. They're under Philistine bondage, and they're pretty faithful that they're going to turn one of their own over to this people. And they do. And Samson slaughters them again, 1,000 men with the fresh jawbone of a donkey. So again, he's in contact with a dead body. It's a fresh jawbone of a donkey. So again, kind of in conflict with that Nazirite vow. But after his victory, after he kills this 1,000 men, he's very thirsty. And he cries out to the Lord, "Shall I die of thirst and fall into the hands of the uncircumcised Philistines. Anything jump out at you about that, about him crying out to God?
Right up to this point, he's not somebody you feel a whole lot of sympathy for.
Mm-hmm.
But God apparently supports him.
Yeah. God gives him what he needs. Despite the fact that he has been very arrogant, that he has not been thankful. You go back to what he said, what Samson said after he kills the 1,000 men with the jawbone of the donkey. In verse 16, with the jawbone of a donkey, heaps upon heaps, with the jawbone of a donkey, I have slain 1,000 men. Not the Spirit of the Lord came mightily and allowed me to slay 1,000 men, which is what actually happened. It's that personal pronoun I. I've done this. And to me, it's a lesson on really how quickly our circumstances can change and how ultimately weak and powerless we are. A lion couldn't take down Samson. 1,000 men couldn't take down Samson. But he got thirsty, and it was thirst that finally humbled him. It wasn't the lion that humbled him. It wasn't the Philistines that humbled him. It was just that physical thirst that finally got him to go to God. He didn't go to God and thank him for his victory. And again, that's something that we can easily recognize. We can easily point out, hey, Samson, dude, you should have thanked God when things were going well instead of waiting until you're desperate and then going to God. But just like we said previously, don't we do that sometimes too? I mean, if we're honest, when things are going really well and it's our world and everybody else is just living in it, sometimes we forget about God and we're not as thankful as we should be, and we don't take time, and we can fall into the same trap Samson did and think, I've done this. Samson said, I killed all these people. And we can think, well, I have got this great career, or I have done these great and wonderful things, without taking the time to say, well, God helped me do this. God gave me the ability to do this. And Samson failed to do that, and just like we do sometimes, he didn't really call on God until he was desperate and he really needed God, without understanding that he always needed God. It wasn't until he was about to die that he needed God. He always needed God, and like Johnny pointed out, despite his attitude, God answered his prayer. God was with him and provides the water that he needed. Paul talked about in 1 Corinthians an issue that was going on that, to me, I think there's a parallel. People were saying, I was baptized of this one or that one, and so they were kind of, whether it was Apollos or Cephas or Paul, they were saying, I'm of this person because they baptized me. And in 1 Corinthians 3, he said, look, I planted, Apollos watered, who gave the increase? God gave the increase. He gave credit to God. He didn't want personal glory. And as God allows us to do things and He uses us, even though we're imperfect, just like Samson, even though we're flawed individuals who make bad choices, just like Samson, and He uses us, we should give Him the credit and be thankful and praise Him for doing those things. Other comments before we close?
It's often easy to see when those that have more abilities, more whatever, like Samson, it's easy for a lot of people to sit back and judge. We sit back and judge, nitpick this. We even nitpick at Samson.
Yep.
And it's obvious that God knew his flaws. It's like God has set some people up to do more. Some people have more to do more with, and everything. And God says, look, don't y'all judge them. I'm the one that judges. Yep. Let them do what I have given them the power to do. Yep. It's up to them to do that. It was up to Samson to bring the hand of God in there and control the Philistines, because obviously the Jews were afraid of him, but Samson wasn't. It almost took someone like the Philistines to fight the Philistines. He had to have that barbaric nature maybe
Yep.
that God gave to him. And he used it wrongly sometimes, as those that today we might use things wrongly that God's given to us, but we, eventually when it comes down to it, he accomplished God's plan. And a lot of times we overlook that,
And I go back to that verse in chapter 14, in verse 4. His father and mother did not know that it was of the Lord that he was seeking an occasion to move against the Philistine. And God used that imperfect person to do what he wanted done. So appreciate the good comments and appreciate